Welcome to today's webinar. I'm Mark Higgins, the Chief Operating Officer of Strategen, and I am delighted to be emceeing what I really believe is going to be a stellar panel today. We've got some great speakers and innovators in the energy storage space. If you don't know already, today's webinar is called Energy Storage or Resilience, Part 2, Storage Deployments. This is an integral part of an energy storage knowledge hub that Strategen works on, produced in partnership with Sandia National Laboratories with funding from the U.S. Department of Energy, Office of Electricity's Energy Storage Program. Before we get started on the content, though, I would like to go through some logistical matters. The agenda today, briefly here, we're going to do some announcements and introductions. We've got about 45 minutes for panel presentations, more or less, which should allow us some time for questions and answers at the end of the session. So if you haven't used GoToWebinar before, it's pretty straightforward. Everybody is going to be muted who is not a panelist. So if you have a question, you can type it anytime during the session. You can see here from the box, there's a question box. Just type it in there. We've got someone curating all of the questions, and we'll be moderating those at the end and getting a chance for everybody to get their questions answered. Today's webinar is being recorded. The recording and slides will be available after the webinar, and you can access those at strategen.com/webinars. So, as I mentioned, this is part of a broader initiative that we have in working with Sandia National Laboratories as our partner, with funding from the U.S. Department of Energy. And the first series of webinars is on storage for resilience. And next month, we've got a webinar on storage as a wholesale market participant. And then in July, we're going to be doing one on rate design trends for behind the meter storage. You can register at that same address that I gave you before, strategen.com/webinars. Okay, this is not about us, but in case you want any information on Strategen, we do a lot of work on energy storage and grid transformation issues around the world. And if you like the content that you're seeing here, something you might want to consider doing is coming to Energy Storage North America this year, where we've got, we're going to be doing a lot of content similar to what you're seeing today. We've got a series on global thought leadership in the energy storage space called the Global Grid Transformation Track. We got a partnership with CalSTART, which is the leading zero emissions vehicles industry group, and we're going to have the largest group of large trucks and heavy-duty vehicles ever on display, I think, anywhere in the world at the event, and it'll be a good opportunity to look at the nexus between transit and the electric grid. And as I mentioned, this is part of a broader knowledge hub that the U.S. Department of Energy, Office of Electricity Energy Storage Program funds. Another component of that is the Global Energy Storage Database. This truly is the global resource for knowledge about project deployments in the energy storage space. We've got over 1,700 projects in the database, about 200 gigawatts of capacity. What makes the database useful, though, is people submitting projects on here. We've got an address on here, energystorageexchange.org, where you can upload new developments and new projects. If you don't see something on there that you know is around and that you can get some press on, please let us know about it. We want to make sure it gets in there. As I mentioned, Sandia National Laboratories is our partner. They are part of the U.S. Department of Energy, who funds work in the energy storage space. The U.S. Department of Energy, Office of Electricity's Energy Storage Program, has been funding all sorts of different initiatives in energy storage, and Sandia's work on grid mod is part of that. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Thomas Lee, who's going to be the moderator. Thomas is the director here at Strategen. He's going to announce all of our wonderful panelists. And please take it away, Thomas.
Thank you, Mark. If you joined us for the last session, when we talked about resilience, which is to define what it was, and we talked about some of the technologies that are being developed to enable storage to provide resilience. So for today, our focus is more on the practical considerations for how you actually deploy energy storage to provide resilience to applications. So our speakers are going to talk about frameworks and tools for planning and designing systems, and also give some examples of projects in the field. Some of the broad questions we'll be touching on today are on your screen here. Things like, how is storage being deployed to provide resilience today? How do you actually measure resilience and prioritize those projects that may be wanting to work on? How do you plan and design a resilience project that includes storage? And last but not least, how do you actually put a value on it and pay for it? So our panel today, we do have an excellent panel, and we want to thank every single one of them for joining us today. We're very, very lucky to have Dr. Imre Juk, Director of the Energy Storage Research Program at the DOE Office of Electricity, which he's led for the last 12 years. He is truly an internationally recognized leader in the field. He's managed nearly all of the major research funding programs that I think have been the source of what makes the energy storage industry what it is today. So we're very, very grateful for all of his work and his leadership, and for providing us with the opportunity to have this webinar today and for speaking with us. He'll be talking about the work that DOE is doing to promote resilience through energy storage in various places, in municipalities, island grids, and also particularly of interest in Puerto Rico. We also have Dr. Eric Vugan, who is a distinguished member of the technical staff at Sandia. He works on the development and application of quantitative methods for analyzing cyber and physical infrastructure systems, including the electric grid. His work has provided research, operational, and policy guidance to multiple federal agencies. And in addition to the dozens of journal articles, conference proceedings, and technical reports that he's authored, he is a co-author of a book called Critical Infrastructure System Security and Resiliency. And he will be talking about a resilience analysis process and how it can be applied to the electric grid. We also have Jessica Teets from the city of San Francisco. She's a distributed energy resource specialist for San Francisco's Department of the Environment, where she works to facilitate the use of distributed energy resources in support of the city's goal to achieve 100% renewables by 2030. Prior to joining the city of San Francisco, she implemented the low-income weatherization program for the Association for Energy Affordability and was part of the renewable energy procurement team at Pacific Gas and Electric. And she's going to be talking about San Francisco's solar storage resiliency program. And finally, Doug Staker is an energy professional who's worked globally in energy for 28 years. He's a pioneer in the world of smart technologies with a focus on smart metering and intelligent energy storage. Currently, he's Vice President of Utility Business Development at Enerock, and they've been developing behind-the-meter energy storage in New York City and a lot of other places, collaborating with local agencies to develop projects to enhance resilience. We want to thank Co-Way in the New York City Mayor's Office for connecting us with Doug to talk about the work that they're doing together, and particularly the Marcus Garvey microgrid project. So thank you again to all of our speakers today, and we'll get started with Dr. Imre Juk from the Department of Energy. Imre, the floor is yours.
Well, hello. It's a pleasure to be here and talk to you about resiliency. I direct the Energy Storage Research Program. I didn't realize that I was muted, so let me do this just a second.
You are not muted now. We've got you loud and clear.
Okay, good enough.
You are on here.
Anyway, once more, this is about resiliency, and I'm the director of the Energy Storage Research Program at the Office of Electricity. And I will talk about some examples of energy storage and microgrids in providing resilience. Now, regardless of what you talk about, it's always the economics. So specifically, we need to develop business cases. And in developing a business case, we have to consider the cost and the value of the system. The cost, of course, is the energy storage device, the power electronics, the facility itself. There's a lot of things that cost money. What's nice about it is that these costs are going down. What's equally important is the value. We have a number of values, particularly in the market economy, that are clearly defined, such as arbitrage, frequency regulation, demand charges, which come by the month and year. But then we also have unmonetized benefits. And resiliency specifically is an unmonetized benefit. We know that we want it, but it's very difficult to assign dollars and cents to it. So next, please. Next. So we want to design for resilience. The pictures are obvious. We have hurricanes, we have earthquakes, we have exploding volcanoes, we have all kinds of natural and unnatural events that disturb the electric grid and make it more difficult to operate. As far as hurricanes and similar events are concerned, I invite you to take a look at the graph. It shows the temperatures in Washington, D.C. As you can see, there's an obvious trend there, which indicates that the situation will get worse, not better. And of course, hurricanes are directly triggered by the temperature profiles of the atmosphere. This situation translates immediately into money, and the second graph shows you the number of billion-dollar damage events per year. Again, we can discern trend there, and for whatever reason, which includes denser population, higher deployment of technology, these disasters are costing us more and more every year. Next, please. Next slide, please. Okay, values such as resiliency, military energy assurance, emergency preparedness, they're all very clear. We know that we want them, but they are difficult to monetize because they are not part of the market structure. But often they are the primary reason why we want to do a storage project. Now, we know microgrids with renewables and storage provide a good solution for resiliency issues. But the trouble is we can't charge the market a regular price. So the business case of the project has to rest on monetizable benefit streams, which we can define. Next, please. Next slide. And I have an example to offer you. This is a small town in Massachusetts. They obtained a grant for an energy storage program. A few of us got together for the groundbreaking, and 3 months later, we had a storage unit in place. And this involved 2 megawatts for 2 hours of storage with existing 3.4 megawatts of PV near the site. Altogether, these were combined into a microgrid, and this microgrid provides resilience for part of the town which includes in particular the police headquarters. Next, please. Okay, and here is storage economics in action. We have storage in the system. We can utilize arbitrage. We can utilize monthly peaks. We can cut down on the annual peaks, and we could, if we wanted to, do frequency regulation as well. We calculated all of these beforehand, and we showed that the system could give a very handsome annual return for the installation. This is how it works for the peaks. You wait for the announced monthly peak, and then when the peak is there, you activate the storage unit, which you have filled up with electricity from your solar establishment. This single event saves you some $17,000. Multiplied by 12, and you get about $200,000 per year in avoided charges. Now, this is for the monthly peaks. Then you do the annual peaks, you do a little bit of arbitrage, and when you put these together, and this is an actual savings chart, you get a total of about $400,000 per year, and this translates to a simple payback period of 6.7 years for a capital cost of $1.7 million per megawatt. So this was one of the first times the resiliency project was actually monetized by a regular business case. We very nicely got a Grid Edge Award for it, and the site has had visitors from all over the world, including Germany, Denmark, England, Japan, Malaysia, Taiwan. It's become famous. Because we can't do this for everyone, we produced a guidance document which you can get on the internet via the Sandia website. Next, please. Okay, we have a whole roster of other projects which are in the works, including a project in Chattanooga, an installation of a microgrid there with 100 kilowatts of vanadium flow battery. The interesting thing is there that the entire town is rigged on the internet, so we have incredible connectivity there. We have a project in Birmingham, Alabama for a utility test site, again vanadium. A project with a different vanadium technology in Worcester, Massachusetts with National Grid. We work with Eugene, Oregon and the Water and Energy Board to put a project there. And we also have a collaboration with the Korean firm Hyosung to put in 1 to 2 megawatts of storage. Next, please. In Cordova, we have a very interesting project. We are teaming up energy storage with hydropower. And, well, it's obvious this is run-of-the-river hydropower. Sometimes there's too much, sometimes there's not enough. And by putting storage in, we make the whole system more resilient, and also we make it pay off better. Nantucket is an interesting one because it's an island, and this worked with National Grid again, and this involves transmission lines to the islands, and by putting in storage, you can defer new transmission lines. And we are going to be exploring how you can use the battery for during periods which are not period peak months, so that you can get maximum use and optimize the system. We have a project in Hawaii, which will allow the installation of more solar. Another island, Decatur Island, and again, it's to optimize the transmission through cables and use it on the local system. We do analysis projects through Sandia in Germany, Joint Base Andrews, the FDA facility at White Oaks, and coming up a project in Singapore. But the one that really interests us and where we're really hoping to have a big influence is the next project, which is in Puerto Rico. As everybody knows, Hurricane Maria devastated the island, but Maria was not the only hurricane which covered Puerto Rico. If you look at the map, you see that every island, every hurricane in the vicinity has a tendency to run straight across the island, and these are all hurricanes of various strengths. The result is that the electric system is the most vulnerable of the systems, and from a fairly good grid, it goes down to an almost invisible grid. And of course, there is the disaster itself. The island has been in shambles, and we are doing what we can to help with the situation. Next, please. Okay, here's what happened. Nearly 100% of the customers were without power. 3.5 million U.S. citizens were impacted, and the estimated damage is between 65 and 115 billion, depending on how much you count. Now, there was a lot of help on the island by other utilities, including, I'm happy to say, the utility at Sterling, who went down there for several weeks with their personnel and equipment. But it behooves the Department of Energy to be involved too. And we deployed $13 million for the Office of Electricity. Largely, this was expended in technical assistance and is still being expended in studies on the optimal placement of storage and microgrids. And of course, modeling the grid, because it's not obvious that the grid should be exactly the same as it was before, through different placement of the grid, we can make it more resilient. At present, there is a report in the works, a fairly large report, which is unfortunately embargoed, so all I can give you is a summary of it. The main thing is that investments in Puerto Rico should result in modern, intelligent infrastructure systems that are affordable, reliable, and resilient. In the near term, of course, we have to patch up whatever we can, but in the medium and long term, this really should be carefully planned, and we should bring to bear all the facilities and abilities of the national labs and the research community. Analysis and planning are, of course, essential in order to de-risk investments, because people will not want to put up storage and microgrid infrastructure if they are not fairly assured that this is indeed a good solution. And we want to further a mix of centralized and distributed energy resources and adequate fuel diversity, so that we bring in solar, wind, fossil fuel, whatever is appropriate. And of course, training and capacity building is extremely important to enable transitioning of systems operations to a new regime. Incorporation of microgrids and energy storage and the strategic use of distributed energy resources to help balance the load was considered a high priority in planning for the new system. Another aspect that needs work is the policy options. And for that, the Department of Energy has brought in the Southern States Energy Board in order to help set up Puerto Rico with a more streamlined policy and governance situation. Of course, again, one has to repeat that these are local matters and DOE can only advise on them. Now, $13 million that we have obtained so far is really not very much considering the overall scope of the problem, but there are $2 billion which have been allocated to HUD, and the Department of Energy expects to get a substantial chunk of that money so we can help the situation with more concrete projects and put infrastructure in place. Next. So the overall picture for storage and microgrids is that with new technologies, cost will indeed go down and safety and reliability will increase. And most importantly, with every successful project that we implement, the value propositions will continue to become clearer and increase. And obviously, as a side product, more jobs will be created. Thank you.
Thank you, Emery. Appreciate your contributions there. Really interesting talk. In the interest of time, we'll just move right along here. Next will be Eric Bugren from Sandia National Labs. Eric, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So one of the statements that Emery made is for us to really maximize our way to become more resilient is we need to do analysis really before we start these when possible. Definitely when we're in the process, but we'd love to do the analysis before the next hurricane strikes. So I'm going to talk briefly about some resilience analysis and metric development work that my colleagues and I have been doing at Sandia. Next slide, please. So when developing these methods, the starting place for us is what are the questions that people are asking when it comes to grid resilience? And the questions generally are rather straightforward. Typically it's, how resilient am I now if I don't do anything and something happens today? Oftentimes people want to know, how can I become more resilient? What are my options? How much more resilient will I become? They want to understand when there's a variety of different factors and facets that go into resilience planning, how should they prioritize as they take on these efforts? And the prioritization can come across various different threats. We never know what's going to hit us in the future. We have to figure out what are the most important things to plan for. The responses, there are a lot of different things that we can do. Which ones are better and which ones should we not prioritize? And then investments. We've got limited budgets and we need to figure out how to get the best bang for our buck. So prioritization is a question that comes up time and time again. And then ultimately trade-offs. Emery mentioned a number of different things beyond resilience that we want. We want safety, we want reliability. And we need to understand as we move forward to improve resilience that we understand what are the potential trade-offs or benefits to these other concepts. I haven't yet worked on a resilience project for the grid where people haven't asked, what about the impact on reliability? So we simply can't forget that. And one of the challenges as we move forward with analysis is there really are no universally accepted analysis approaches or metrics. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the research that Sandia has been doing to advance that effort. Next slide, please. So a lot of the discussion around metrics starts with what's the difference between reliability metrics and what we want for resilience metrics. And reliability metrics have been designed for these kind of high probability, low consequence expected events. So we're all familiar with N-1 planning, and reliability certainly comes into play there. They generally don't consider all the elements of risk, and they typically think about reliability in a binary sense. Your grid is either in a reliable state or not. The metrics tend to focus on impacts to the grid itself and its operations and ability to deliver power. Resilience metrics kind of take a different bent. First off, the event space is very different. Resilience metrics should be looking at these low probability, high consequences events that we don't see every day, like hurricanes, like earthquakes, like cyber attacks. When possible, you want to be able to consider what are the threats that you're designing against, how vulnerable is your system to those threats, and what are the consequences that could result from that. So oftentimes you'll see resilience metrics described in a probabilistic sense or with uncertainty associated with them. Also, when we think about resilience, we usually talk about it on a continuous spectrum. It's more or less resilient as opposed to it is or is not resilient. And finally, when we come down to actually measuring consequences, we certainly look at impacts to the grid with resilience metrics, but there are other factors that we might consider, such as community factors, population, dependent infrastructures, and economics are something that tend to come to rise in our resilience analyses. Next slide, please. So in order to come up with the metrics, we've designed a kind of high-level resilience analysis process. And the first step always starts out with defining what are our resilience goals. So are we trying to see how we've done historically? What's our current state? Are we trying to do some investment planning? We need to state that at the outset and understand what's the intent behind the analysis. Next thing then is we define the system of interest and the associated metrics. Are we just looking at distribution? Are we looking at transmission, generation? Are we looking at the surrounding community or region? And then what are the associated metrics that the stakeholders really think about when valuing and measuring the impact of resilience? Then you need to select the threats of interest, which are the ones that are going to be the highest priority and that we can perform the analysis against. Understand how the grid is affected by those threats. Is it damage to equipment? Is it changes in operations? How long is it going to last? How bad will it be? And so once we understand the level with which our grid operations will be disrupted, then typically what we do is we take that information and we feed it into a set of computer models. And because most of our resilience analyses tend to be forward-looking, how good would we be if something happened in the future or if we did this investment? The models help us do the projections and come up with the estimates, the consequences, and the benefits. And if we do this all kind of on our current state, then we can repeat this process with potential improvements and mitigations to help us understand what are the resilience improvements associated with particular options. Next slide, please. So I kind of ran through this at a high level, and I've got a couple of references if you want to dig a little bit deeper. But I want to give a brief example of where Sandia has been using this process to analyze resilience. We've been working with City of New Orleans for a couple of years. Bobby Jeffers, one of my colleagues, is leading the effort currently. And New Orleans is really interested in understanding how can they improve community resilience to hurricanes through the implementation of some microgrids. So they're really interested not only in the grid itself, but the city at large, and specifically the impact on lifeline infrastructure. So the metrics with which they're using to analyze resilience there are the number of people in New Orleans who would or would not have access to these lifeline services. They're specifically interested in hurricanes. We've looked at a variety of different scenarios based on trajectory and strength. And the way in which these hurricanes damage the grid and affect operations is both through the extreme winds, but the flooding. And so we need to understand how those affect the grid operations. So Sandia and Los Alamos have a set of computer models. We understand where the flooding is expected to occur, what lines are expected to be affected. And through this project, the team was able to come up with about 24 different possible microgrid configurations. They've narrowed it down to 3 that they're looking at and actively evaluating through the microgrid design toolkit to figure out what are the quantitative resilience benefits, what are the associated costs. And not only are they looking at kind of the design itself, but they're working with the local utility to figure out how they could integrate microgrids into their integrated resource planning processes. So this is a project that's been going a couple of years. It's still ongoing, but it's been a great opportunity to partner with the community and to take this analysis process and really provide them some technical support. There's a number of other communities that we're working with, but I think for now I'll stop and conclude my comments for now.
Well, great. Thank you, Eric. That was really high impact work there. Appreciate your sharing it with us today. Next up, we have Jessica Teese from the City of San Francisco, Department of the Environment. Jessica, the floor is yours.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. So for my portion of the panel, I'm going to share with you our Solar Plus Storage for Resiliency project. This is a project that examines the use of standalone solar storage systems at facilities throughout the city that would serve critical loads in time of emergencies. So looking at churches, schools, libraries, at shelters, communication centers, in the event of the next large-scale grid outage. This is a feasibility study, not a design bid build. Next slide, please. So the overarching goal of this project is to expand the solar market by serving as a national model for integrating solar and storage systems into existing emergency response plans. As you may or may not know, San Francisco's anticipated disaster is a major earthquake, but we're also surrounded by seawater. So we're also planning for sea level rise and other effects of climate change. So this project really creates that intersection of the city's climate and resiliency goals. With this project, we drew on city's leadership in emergency response planning and climate readiness folks, as well as engaging a working group of stakeholders to create a roadmap of solar and storage deployment for resiliency. This included technical feasibility, policy considerations, and most importantly, how to fund these projects. Next slide, please. So for this project, there was a Lifelines Council study that studied how long it will take for the electricity and gas system to be fully restored after an earthquake of about 7.9 magnitude. And they estimated the electricity will be 95% restored after 1 week. So for our project, we are planning for systems to be served during a 3 to 7 day grid outage. Just real quick, as you can see on the chart in front of you, the y-axis shows the percentage and the X shows the number of days. And just as you can see, the chart also shows that it will take about 6 months for the gas system to be fully restored, which is why we decided to focus on the electricity portion. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, we work with multiple various city departments involved in emergency planning, both for city operations and as well as neighborhood empowerment folks, to help identify all the buildings that will play a critical role in disaster recovery. So as you can see up here, we have Department of Emergency Management, Public Health, San Francisco Public Utilities Commission, as well as our local utility, Pacific Gas and Electric, PG&E, and other folks. Next slide, please. So this is just a quick overview of the project, and we'll go into more details in the upcoming slides where I can describe more about everything from how we chose our sites to how we determine how much energy load that they would have and the resources that we produce for you to delve more into. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Thanks. So as mentioned earlier, we work with so many different stakeholders, right? So what we did from our conversations and meetings with them is, one, identify all the buildings that will play a critical role in disaster recovery, from fire stations to places of worship. And then what we did was mapped out those facilities and overlaid them with information about the building's seismic ratings, as well as areas that are prone to liquefaction and tsunamis. And from our conversations, we also figured out which roofs are suitable for solar, and also perhaps the building was scheduled for renovation in a few years, so that if they were to install solar plus storage, that system would match the existing building project timeline efforts for funding to increase the chance that a pilot will be deployed and rolled into the existing workload. As we kind of overlaid all of these different layers, we narrowed down each of the sites. We also asked our city supervisors to help us identify priority sites in each district that would help serve their most vulnerable populations. And then we narrowed it down to about 15 case studies. Next slide, please. So after we have our site figured out, we need to determine what are the critical loads during a large-scale grid outage. So the questions we asked was, how will those buildings be used after disaster, and what devices will need to be powered? Not all facilities, from what we found out, not all facilities have power needs specifically after disaster, and not all require power immediately after a disaster. So some of the questions we asked is, hey, what is the role of the facility? Could it be a shelter? Could there be food provisions? Is there pots or those type of questions? What are hours it will operate? Are we planning for this to be 9 to 5, or is this a shelter so that it will mostly be, we'll need the electricity low, phone charge, what have you, from maybe 6 to morning? What are the number of occupants that will be using the space? And then ultimately, what are the kind of appliances and electrical equipment that we should power? Next slide, please. So we figured that out for each of our case studies. And then now that we know the power loads, we need to size it. From this project, from this grant, we developed a free solar plus storage sizing tool that can help tell us that. So what this tool does is that it allows building owners, managers, city departments to develop equipment sizing before embarking on a more detailed study. It's really targeted to those who are interested but are unsure of whether to proceed. So it really gives them that initial data point to start thinking about system size, and also the physical size. Do I even have enough physical size in my building to install such a system? And for us, a city, for example, it's important because there's so many layers of approval to even try to first figure out whether or not it's suitable, right? So this really saves time in terms of removing the RFP or RFQ to even try to figure out whether solar plus storage is suitable for you. So the idea is to take this, you enter your information, and it'll still spit out a one-pager that you can take to a vendor for a price estimate, and say, hey, does this look suitable? You ask, what's the financial analysis, payback period, and then go from there. For this tool, you don't need any expertise. You do need some basic background. It's modeled after PV watts. In addition to entering your physical space on your roof that you have and so forth, there are more advanced options, like if you have existing PV or a diesel generator, and it'll spit out a typical use case and a worst case scenario for you. And once again, this is free and available anywhere nationwide. Next slide, please. So now that we have our site selected, we have our building load, and we can have an idea, general idea of whether or not it will be suitable for a building in both system and physical size. Under this grant, we also explore financing options. while it's ideal, as someone mentioned earlier, to install solar plus storage in every shelter, the reality of financing and municipal budgeting creates a large barrier to install solar ubiquitously across all critical facilities. So we worked with our San Francisco Capital Planning Committee to start asking these questions. How can we get these funded? How can we take our project from feasibility to actual installation? We explore bonds, public-private partnerships, and so forth. In addition to financing, there are also permitting and safety concerns. We worked with our fire department and building inspection to address any concerns they have. Under this grant, we also organized a fire code and safety battery storage symposium where we invited fire officials and building departments throughout the Bay Area and some in Southern California. We have notes and additional information on our website if you're interested, just to let them know of upcoming codes and start that conversation. Next slide, please. So this is a 4-year project that ends at the end of this year. In addition to the solarresilient.org tool that I just mentioned earlier, we also have other resources available. We have a published roadmap that describes our process, what worked, what didn't, targeted for other city and counties that want to replicate this in their own municipal area. We also have a best practices manual. We know that when you have a roadmap of 100 pages, not everyone has time. So the best practice manual, it's really a truncated version of that. We also have other resources from our financial analysis summary, our symposium, PowerPoint and report, and et cetera on our website. Next slide, please. So we're not done yet. We have 6 more months. As I mentioned, like all capital projects, you need funding. This is a feasibility study. There is no money for implementation. So we're really working hard to transition the feasibility study into implementation. Last winter, we presented to our capital planning committee, and the feedback we received was that they need more information on valuing the avoided cost of disruption. For those of you that may not know, the economics of the solar plus storage system itself just doesn't work because our municipal sites are served by Hetch Hetchy hydro, cheap electricity, and therefore the return on investment just wouldn't work solely based on that. So therefore, as you can see on your screen, we have a new set of stakeholders that we will work with between now and the end of the year to help us identify a path forward valuing resiliency, to help influence our capital planning committee and help make them help with their decision to help fund this solar plus storage, these projects throughout the city and county. Our next step, and this is just general, is to meet again with our internal city colleagues, as well as other cities where large-scale outage has occurred, learn from them, and also meet with folks such as Oxfam, FEMA, and American Red Cross to begin to help us monetize disruptions and damages that specific to the city and county of San Francisco. Next slide, please. That is the end of my portion. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Jessica. Again, some really great work, and thank you for sharing it with us. Moving on to our next speaker, Doug Staker from Enernoc is going to talk about the Market Scarvey Apartments microgrid. Doug, the floor is yours.
Great, thanks, Thomas, and thanks, Mark. Let's just jump to the next slide. So one of the things that Eric said that I think is important is that, if you think about grid stress can be one of the triggers as far as causing outage. And I'm going to talk about a project that we did as part of Con Ed service territory. This is in the Brooklyn, Queens Demand Management Program. This is a segment of Brooklyn and Queens that most of the load that this substation serves is multifamily residential housing. And so Con Ed has a very robust demand response program that involves a lot of commercial load that's able to scale back whenever we hit times of grid stress, which typically in New York is times during peak air conditioning loading. The challenge in this part of the network is that this is primarily residential load, and it is the majority of the load is on average 12-unit multifamily buildings, which have about a 30 kW peak for each building. So it's very difficult to put together a demand response program that's able to respond during times of grid stress. Coupled with that, the substation that serves this network is constrained by a transmission line that comes in. And the upgrade to that transmission line, it's short by 53 megawatts is the projection for this year. And the real challenge is that shortage or the time period of overstress in this network is basically 4 12-hour periods on average in the summer. And the cost to upgrade that transmission line is somewhere around $1.2 billion. It's been several summers since we've had high heat stress in the New York area. Back in 2014, we did have, it was the most frequent period where we had heat stress and high air conditioning load. And unfortunately, in this segment of the service territory, they had to resort to rolling blackouts to support the grid. That was the only part of the network that was seeing that. And it doesn't go over well where the only part of your service territory you're doing rolling blackout has the highest concentration of low-income housing, when all of Manhattan is able to reduce load and manage through the stress conditions. So Con Ed put this program together in conjunction with the Public Service Commission that said, instead of doing that non-wire solution, that upgrade, let's do a non-wire solution. Here's $200 million. Let's go figure out how to manage that load. And let's jump to the next slide, please. So what we were able to do is, again, like I said, most of these buildings are small. They're 12-unit apartments. The Marcus Garvey Village was a low-income housing project that's master metered. It has 625 apartments associated with it. It's a low-rise project. There are only 2 stories. It's spread across 6 city blocks, and it really provided us an opportunity to make a sizable system that was able to respond and be able to be managed and help reduce load reduction during grid stress events. And with the economics in the Con Ed service territory, we're able to build a demand charge savings program around this that is able to help pay for the system, provide grid reduction when it's needed, and be able to provide some resiliency into the project whenever there's a extended outage. And Hurricane Sandy really changed the thinking in the area here. People were stunned that after the hurricane, a lot of the solar systems that were deployed didn't operate. And so it was a very interesting project that we were able to put together in conjunction with Con Ed. It consists of a 300 kW, 1.2 megawatt hour battery storage system that's coupled with a 400 kW distributed PV system. And on top of this, a Bloom Energy server that is a 400 kW fuel cell. So the combination of those 3 systems, if you jump to the next slide, please, consists of our microgrid. And one of the things is this is in a service territory that this is all electric heat. So the winter peak is about 3 megawatts, but the stress condition is in the summer when the air conditioning load is only about 1 megawatt. So in trying to make the economics work, we couldn't build a big enough system to power all of the facility during a winter peaking event. So we have enough power that we can supply the management, the security office, and a community room that can provide heat. It can provide phone charging. It's a big enough room for gathering for people. And it was the most equitable way to put the program together. So during an extended outage, the solar and storage can support this main center here within the complex to provide backup power and a gathering spot for people to get electricity, stay warm, get the phones charged, and find out what's going on, also while maintaining the management and security system. So next slide, please. So one of the key things in a program like this is, and we've heard in several of the points earlier today, is, how do you cost justify these things? So we developed a value stacking methodology that fundamentally keys off of three areas here. First of all, demand charge management. In New York, we're very fortunate. We have a rate structure that allows us to do demand charge reduction daily rather than the classic monthly demand charge reduction profile. So that graph you see on the slide there is a picture of the profile of a week last May, where that large spike that you see kind of in the middle, that was a day where the heat came up, or and the air conditioning load came upon us. But you can see the blue line in the center, that's how we make the load look to Con Ed. And when the solar shows up midday, you see those dips. We're absorbing that solar, flattening that load, shaving the peaks, and we drive that every day as far as helping put the economics together to fund this project. What's key to that is that if tomorrow looks like a call event for a demand response day, we're able to forego demand charge savings for that day, save all that energy up. And in this part of the network peak occurs between 8 p.m. and midnight. So we have to save that solar energy and time shift it almost 8 hours to be able to do a full bulk dispatch and release that storage system so that we get a 300 kW reduction for 4 hours of load reduction, which is our commitment to that program. And we're paid an incentive, a capacity reservation for that capability. Plus, whenever we perform, we receive $5 a kilowatt hour in payment. So it really helps with the economics. And then finally, one of the things that you often hear people talk about, how do you participate in some of the wholesale markets? Well, we participate in day-ahead hourly pricing from a supply perspective. That provides us opportunity to be able to charge when the rates are very low, and then use that energy to discharge when the rates are very high. There's some arbitrage that's associated with that, and it really helps roll into the overall financial package for how do you cost justify these systems. Next slide, please. So finally, the last piece I wanted to cover is, all of these storage systems, how do these operate? How do they function? How do you achieve all these different varying value streams? And fundamentally, most people that have systems that participate in behind the meter energy storage have an optimization engine that does that automatically. Our system looks at all those economic factors that key in. It also knows what the cost of cycling a battery is. It also knows what the weather model looks like. It knows what triggers are most likely to trigger an event in New York. Surprisingly enough, what triggers an event in New York is not so much what the high temperature is for the day, but it's what is the temperature overnight. And if the city doesn't cool down, that has the highest probability of triggering a demand response event. So this optimization engine looks at all of those variables every 15 minutes, and it plots out what's the operating profile for the next 24 hours. So it looks at all those inputs, whether it's the supply, what the incentive from certain programs, what are you doing? Do we have excess solar? What's the load in the building looking like? Do we forecast a load increase? All of that stuff's done automatically. And every 15 minutes, we just continue to readjust that operating plan and try to shape that operation for the next 24 hours in real time. Okay, next slide, please. So fundamentally, non-wire solutions are becoming the talk across the country, finding ways that utilities can reduce their or create a asset deferment and be able to earn on that. There are things that we're doing out here where Con Ed was able to rate-base this capability, and we're looking at other solutions known as performance-based rate making to help that. Being able to provide energy as a service, we offer this to the building owner as a shared savings opportunity. We own the equipment, installed it, and we get paid through our portion of the shared savings. Being able to manage power cost and mixed income housing is just really the right thing to do. And resilience will continue to be ongoing after the summer we had and then the winter we had. Extended outages are just getting to be more frequent and occur more often. So that's the end of my presentation, and thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Doug. I really appreciate that. Great, sounds like a great project there, again, with a lot of really good impact. That concludes all of the presentations. We now move on to Q&A. We've got quite a few questions already, but please, if you do have a question, go ahead and type it into the question box in your GoToWebinar app. We'll be taking questions in writing, so if you have one, go and, like I said, just type it in there. No need to raise your hand, and we'll get to them here. Got quite a lot of questions. A lot of them sort of focused more toward the economic side of things. Here's one. One very interesting here. It'll start with maybe a bit of a challenging one. Here is well, the value of resiliency is hard to quantify. The cost of it is actually fairly easy. The cost of a project is fairly straightforward. The question here is, well, how should it be apportioned, right? If resilience is local, right, then what should we do about tariffs, rate structures, other economics to make sure that to distribute those costs fairly between make sure those are paying and those who are benefiting is fair. Does anybody have any thoughts on that? Particularly if you're not receiving microgrids. Sorry, go ahead.
One of the things that we've looked at is that in several other projects that we've done is we've looked at what is the incurred cost for not operating. In some of our other projects, we have a resiliency system down in Costa Rica, in a medical manufacturing facility, and that system is designed to keep the clean room operational. So it's very easy to look at if that clean room goes down and they have to scrap the work in process. It's anywhere from $40,000 to $100,000 in work in process that has to be scrapped. What's more challenging, and what we often hear in New York, is until you have delivered food and water up to your clients that are stuck in a 58-floor high-rise, until you've done that twice a day for a week straight, as people did in Hurricane Sandy, when people ask, what's the value of resiliency? And they say, well, until you've had that exercising process there, it's priceless, right? It is just a difficult challenge. And so it's same thing here with what we have out in Marcus Garvey, to be able to, where there were rolling blackouts and extended outages during Sandy and things like that, just to be able to have a community room where people can charge phones and get heat if they need it, or get air conditioning, have a cooling center. I think those things are very hard to monetize, but they just make everybody feel good to know that you have that capability. And as Jessica covered in their analysis, by targeting that across an area, it just helps, I think, with the overall planning of extended outages.
You're great. Thanks for that, Doug. Any thoughts, maybe Jessica? Given that you're with the city, as part of your process, have you thought about the cost and cost allocations and things like that, or any work that you've done in your previous experience would speak to that? And just make sure to take your phone off mute. Nope, we might have lost Jessica there temporarily. Imre or Eric, any thoughts there on cost allocation for resilience projects?
Yeah, am I mute?
Nope, we can hear you loud and clear.
Okay, well, it is a very complicated problem that goes into, the whole business of electricity planning. If you put in a new transmission line, who pays for it? Some people will say, well, we don't need that transmission line. We are fine. Why should we pay for it? And with resiliency, it's similar. There are some people who need it, some people who don't need it, and so who should pay for it? And that's exactly why I like projects that provide resilience, but basically pay for themselves, or at least for a large part of the costs. And as we have just seen in several examples. It can be done. It just needs ingenuity and good design.
Great, thank you, Imre. A question here for Eric, actually. Is Sandia able to review and analyze a specific project for value attributes? Is that something that your group can do?
So that's something that we frequently get asked to do is to come in and either provide an assessment, and usually it's kind of what's our current level, and then what are our options and what could provide some benefit. So we frequently do that kind of work, and I think depending on the instance, so what is the process it would take to get to Sandia to do something like that? We can handle that offline, but assessments are something that we certainly are well versed in and certainly within our bailiwick.
Okay, great. And certainly we can put your contact information up in the slides, and if people would like to follow up, you can feel free to follow up with Sandia.
That would be great.
Great. Yeah, thanks. And do we have Jessica back? Sounds like perhaps not. Okay. There are a couple of questions here for San Francisco for Jessica. We'll forward those on to her, and she can follow up with those offline. A question here for Doug. How much of the power savings could you achieve? How much power savings could you achieve through the BQDM program within that $200 million budget? And is there a place where people who are interested can access more information?
You mean, well, the incentives, I mean, we reduced about, we saved the facility about 20% in their energy costs through just the operations and the involvement in the demand response program. So typically, just rough rule of thumb, it's somewhere between 10 and 20% of the service or the all-in electricity cost for the facility.
Great, thanks. Great, thank you, Doug. Question here, it looks probably best for Imre. Question here about, in addition to the transmission and distribution infrastructure, there's someone here who actually visited Puerto Rico and saw actually, destruction of the installed PV and wind infrastructure. Is DOE doing any work to help, beef up that infrastructure as well, the actual generation part of it?
Well, that would not fall under my energy storage program, but I am sure the wind and solar parts of DOE are seriously involved in that aspect.
Great, and thanks for that. Another question here, probably for Doug, as you think about these deployments, what about fire safety in terms of how when you design and place these systems?
We have been very involved with the fire department in New York in the whole concept of how do you design these systems so that it meets their needs and understand the code and the analysis there. So we've been able to achieve and get permitted through the fire department. And through our collaboration with them we have a dry agent system that's in the container, and then we have a backup system, which is known as a deluge system, that's able to flood the container in case we hit a catastrophic event. But been very collaborative working with FDNY in that whole design.
Okay, great. And for Imre, this was actually a question about the Stirling installation. What happens there if the battery isn't charged and there's an outage?
Well, if the battery isn't charged and there's an outage, then you don't have any electricity. But no, in general, the battery will be charged, and it will be responding to the monthly peaks, which are well defined, and the yearly peak is reasonably well defined. Suppose there were a really bad weather event coming along, then they would go into an operation where they would just keep their batteries charged. So they would be ready to do run the police station as an emergency center. This is quite similar to a project we did with Green Mountain Power in Vermont, where the first requirement actually was to have an emergency center. We just showed them how to make the operation pay for itself. But yes, competing use patterns, benefit streams, is a serious problem. And to some degree, that's what the optimization engine does. But you have to set your optimization engine aside when you have an imminent disaster coming.
Right, and I think you touched on it there, the kind of the importance of the optimization engine and some of the predictive, some of the predictive modeling that gets done. I think Doug, you touched on that a little bit as well. When you were designing the Marcus Garvey project, how much work had to go into actually thinking about that particular eventuality or possibility?
Well, you think about that a lot because, one of the key parts is if you think about when a DR event, a demand response event, is going to be called, there's a high probability that you can incur an outage. And so in some regards, you have to think about you look at the forecast and understand, does the forecast look like it's close within bounds, or does it look like it could be extreme? You may change your whole operating plan. Instead of delivering all the load reduction, you may hold about 50% of that back just in case you do have an outage. But it's also why we like to couple storage with another generation source, be it CHP or solar or a fuel cell or whatever, because then if the outage is extended, you've got capability to recharge that storage over time.
Exactly. That's what Sterling is doing, and that's what Green Mountain Power is doing.
Great. Great, thanks. Sorry, a couple of recent questions here. Let me just read them for a moment. Actually, there's a question here about standards and guidelines. Imre or Eric, do you know if NERC is working on guidelines and standards for resiliency with regard to system performance?
Well, Sandia and P&L, two of our labs, have a very vigorous program of developing standards for both safety and reliability. And of course, those standards are only suggestions, and they then eventually go to standard setting organizations like IEEE or Underwriters Lab or whoever, and eventually they become standard regulations. Sandia on its website has a long paper that lists all the rules and regulations and standards that might be of relevance if you put in a storage system. You might find that helpful.
And a quick question here. Sorry,
just
Doug.
to follow up on to that with regards to resilience standards. So there currently aren't any, to my knowledge. It's certainly something that NERC and many others are definitely interested in, but no formal ones to date with respect to resilience.
Great. Okay, well, we are just at our time here, and I see just quite a few questions remaining. So again, as I mentioned, what we'll do is we'll take these questions, and if our panelists wouldn't mind, we'll just send them to you by email, and then you can respond offline if that's all right. Again, thank you very much to everybody.
That sounds great.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much, everybody, for joining us today. Just as a reminder to, I'm trying to advance slides here. Just a reminder to please fill out the survey that will be coming your way, and also to join us for one of our future upcoming webinars again in June and July. Thank you again, and have a good day.